Okay, I think we should start now. So thank you everyone for coming and making the effort. We're actually very excited about this afternoon because this is the first time we've tried to do this and possibly the first of many. We'll see how instructive it is. So my name is Sonia Gandhi. I'm one of the clinician scientists here. I'm a neurologist and my area of research is in cellular modelling of Parkinson's disease. But Parashkev and I sit on the BRC Translational Neuroscience board. And one major gap that has been identified is in our understanding of and use of deep learning methods in our research, but specifically now in the era of generative AI. So what I'm hoping we will learn today collectively as a group is to answer a few questions that you may know more about by the end of the afternoon than you did before you came, which is, what is generative AI? How is it different from more traditional AI approaches? How can it be used in neuroscience? How can it be used in healthcare? And how can we use it well and wisely, which I'm hoping the esteemed panel will be able to answer. So I'm very grateful to Hannah, who's been our coordinator at the UCL Movement Disorder Centre, for organising today and for helping to coordinate it, and of course to Parashkev, who has put together this programme. And I'm going to ask Parashkev to come and give an introduction to generative AI to start us off.
Thanks very much, Sonia. So the idea here is, on the one hand, to introduce an approach, necessarily in general terms, but on the other also to show how it might be practically applied. And so forgive me if some of these comments appear very abstract, but we'll see that they have profound practical implications, which will be examined in the talks to come and also the case studies later. Let's just remind ourselves what it is that we're doing in general in neuroscience, whether clinical or indeed experimental. We are ultimately trying to arrive at some kind of mechanism and to produce a set of models that are often displayed in this kind of hierarchy, beginning with description, then moving to prediction, prescription, and ultimately a mechanistic understanding. And this pyramid is seen as describing a natural evolution, and that everyone wants to be right at the apex, focusing on the mechanism. Now, the question is, why is the building of models here difficult? Well, the fundamental problem is that the systems that we're studying here, the brain, but really biological systems more generally, are extraordinarily complex. Their intrinsic dimensionality, that is the number of features that one needs in order to describe them adequately, is very large. And so the minimum data scale, in order to be able to fit a model that captures the behavior of the system well, ends up scaling, at least in theory, exponentially with dimensionality. So it becomes harder and harder, the more complex the system is, to gather sufficient data in order to make the model work. Now, the question is, what do we rely in order to build that model? Well, ultimately, we have to begin from the base. We need to begin from the description. And the available description in the biological realm is actually surprisingly minimal. The closest we have to a manual of a human being is the genome. But of course, the relationship between the information content in the genome and the complexity of even something like just the brain, leaving the rest of the body aside, is incredibly difficult. What I've got represented here is the relative maximum information content of the genome versus the brain under very conservative assumptions. This is proportional in terms of the area of the two circles. The genome you can hardly see. So because we do not have an adequate manual, the task of description is incredibly difficult. What is more, such tools as we have in order to capture the state of the brain or the body more generally, its structure and physiology, are imperfect. We almost never have a quantification of any system that gives us its states clearly and unambiguously and precisely across the full range of possibilities. What we have is a representation that's noisy, it's biased, it's incomplete. It doesn't give us the full picture. It's not the image on the left, it's much more like something on the right. So where does AI come into all of this? Well, let's think about what it is the conventional statistical models do. They take the data and they try to find some sort of decision boundary within it in relation to prediction, to some downstream task. That is what statistical models generally do. That's what we always do in science. Now, conventional AI merely complicates that process. It makes the models more expressive so that we can find more complex decision boundaries. And what it introduces is greater flexibility in finding those boundaries. But the fundamental task remains the same. We are learning some sort of discriminating boundary between a set of aspects of a system of interest. What generative AI does is to change the approach quite radically. Rather than looking for a decision boundary, what we try to infer is what is the data generative process, what lies behind the data, not what follows from the data. So that gives us not the actuality of a data set, but the possibility, indeed the limits of possibility of the process that gives rise to it. And the reason we speak of generation here, and the reason generation is what is often used as an illustration of a generative model, is not because the generated samples are themselves interesting, but because the capacity for synthesis is the best evidence for a capacity for analysis. It essentially shows you that the model has learnt the underlying distribution. And it is capturing that that gives you the downstream utility, much greater downstream utility than conventional methods. So here's an example. This is actually from Mo's work, Mo Zain in my group, on, of all things, butterflies. I think this is based on 100,000 butterflies from the Natural History Museum. Here's a model that has learned the distribution of appearances of butterflies. And this is a diffusion model, so it's learning it by mapping butterflies to noise and then back again. So you can see here a purely synthetic butterfly emerging from noise. The critical capability that this demonstrates is, of course, not the synthesis of a single butterfly, but the ability to capture variations of the possible instances of butterflies across, in this case, a single species, but also potentially across multiple species. Now, this is based on 100,000, which is a good number, but it may not be enough. You can see it's making some failures here and there. But I think it's quite striking that it has learnt the space of possible butterfly appearances. And you can see it's done a pretty good job of it. Now, learning the space of possible appearances, conditioned on such labels that one has, for example, different species, means that what we can now do is predict what might happen if there are combinations of characteristics that may not have been observed in the data set. Here we have counterfactuals of what happens if different species succeed in mating, which of course they cannot in reality. And the point here is not that this produces very interesting chimeras, but rather that what the model has learned is what is the relationship between these features so as to be able to explore the space of possibility fully. And that is often where interesting boundaries for downstream tasks will lie. So the general point to finish on is that the capabilities of these models to be able to capture the underlying distribution allow us to break the fundamental problem, the curse of dimensionality, which is the increase in the number of data that one needs in order to be able to fit a model as dimensionality increases. So one of the amazing things about these models is that they appear to scale linearly with the amount of available data. And so what seemed previously to be infeasible with the data we have now becomes possible. There's a wide array of other characteristics that also help us, but one can think of that as being perhaps the critical. They can capture complexity much more efficiently and they can render it feasible with the relatively small data sets that we generally tend to have in our domain. So I will stop there and hand over to the first speaker. Carole.
Hello, everyone. So I'm Carole Sudre. I'm working at the MRC Unit for Lifelong Health and Aging and at the Center for Medical Image Computing, mostly on biomarkers extraction and trying to understand a bit cerebrovascular disease. And I'm not that much of a user and developer of generative AI. I'm much more of a conventional AI person, but obviously, like everyone else, I'm interested in this new wave, and I'm interested in knowing what we can do with it. So today, the talks that I'm presenting, I've been asked to talk about imaging and generative AI, so I will try, but mostly apply to neuroimaging if I can, and trying to show some of the models that we have available to us with generative AI and how people have found very clever and creative way of using those models for various applications that we need in the field of neuroimaging. So we'll just try to first motivate a bit the use of generative AI in imaging and neuroimaging in particular. Mention a few of the methods, going briefly through the methods, and then focusing a bit on application, maybe thinking of new things that we can do, and also thinking of all the current challenges and possible issues that we may have and that we may not have thought about with generative AI, because sometimes it's very easy to be enthusiastic about a new method and then we don't realize exactly what it entails or what the downstream effect can be. So, generate, when you go to Oxford Dictionary and so on, generates, bring into being, creating new things. And for us, in terms of medical imaging, it may mean bringing to new what's missing, what we don't have access to, what we would like to have, what we don't know yet, in the sense of what will be the advent of that patient if I give that person that treatment. And use of what we don't have enough of. And in the mix and in the relationship between conventional AI and generative AI, you may think of that as, oh, I don't have enough training data, or I have a very imbalanced data set. Can I create something that will help me tackle down better my downstream tasks? So for instance, I don't have enough examples of individuals with lacunes or individuals with microbleeds. Can I create artificially those examples to help my downstream decision boundary training of detection segmentations of microbleeds, for instance? And when you think of different type of applications, commonly in medical imaging, you can think of clinically the inconsistency between protocols. Just if you look at the hospital here, if you look at all the different protocols, every single clinician may have different MRI protocols they may want to apply to certain individuals. And if you want to combine those and to try to train something from them, you may want to have a way of, amalgamating everything, transferring from one modality to the next. You may have some very rare pathologies only seen in that specific hospital because only those specific individuals have been located here, or that are very sparse across the world and you want to gather that in some way or create new examples thereof. You may have also, and I'm sure you may have encountered that, people who are not compliant to the imaging. So for instance, where you have a lot of motion artifacts or a lot of noise in your acquisition, and you may want to accommodate for it without having to say, well, I need to delete that patient, while that patient in particular may be the one that you want to keep in your data set because it's actually very informative. And because maybe if you actually remove them from your data set, you are introducing bias because those may be the most severely affected people. You may want to do some data sharing, but there may be some difficulty to that due to a lot of privacy issues, due to a lot of regulation across different countries. And actually, in that case, maybe synthetic data is better. I mentioned data imbalance. You may have also a question of data augmentation. And I mentioned before the possibility of predicting trajectory and predicting the future. So when you think of generative AI, actually what you see usually when you have training samples, it's just that, it's samples. It's individual points that you have here and there that are supposed to, in some way, if you have enough data, and that's again the curse of data we mentioned before, represent fully what's available out there, so what's the true distribution. And often the problem is that it's only, sampling sparsely inside the distribution, but it doesn't give you the full line of the distribution. And what generative AI is trying to do is actually trying to get to sample from that overall distribution to give you more possible samples that reflect the reality of the distribution. And so for that, you have these 4 main models. So variational autoencoders, generative adversarial networks, normalizing flows, and diffusion models. They are the kind of main ones in the families of generative models, but all come to some degree to the same principle of trying to get to a level of the data that is condensed in some way, from which we can sample and reconstruct back to get a new possible sample representative of the distribution it's lying in. So I will try to go through them very briefly to try to explain a bit what they are doing and how similar they are to one another or different. So the first one is a variational autoencoder, and basically what you are trying to do is create what we call a latent space, which is a compressed version of the overall space of the data. And that actually VNE are used for data compression when you have too much data, too heavy. And then afterwards you try to have in that latent space some form of a distribution that you know very well, such as Gaussian distribution with a mean and standard deviation across multiple dimensions. And then you try to sample from it and reconstruct back what you would get given the features that you have learned in your encoding process. So you use that a lot for anomaly detection, for prediction evolution, and for data compression. And the idea when you optimize those models is to limit the reconstruction error between when you encode and when you decode, and making sure that inside the latent space you are close, the distribution is close enough to the distribution target that you have. Next on to the generative adversarial network. So that one is more of a game of I'm trying to mimic something and create something that look like the truth, and on the other one, someone telling you, I'm telling you, you are actually faking it and you are creating something that is not there, or actually you are getting very good and I can't distinguish anything. So the idea here is you have one part of the model that is trying to make as good a prediction or a sample as possible that looks as realistic as possible, and the backward discriminator that is telling you, no, you're not good enough, I can still tell what's real, what's fake. And for medical imaging, so obviously you have the supervised manner where you are just trying to translate from one to the next, where you need pair data. But in our context of medical imaging, where you have often missing data, where you want to use that for cross-modality translation and so on, people have built some other alternative, for instance, the cycle gun, where you don't need pair data. So you can go from one to the next, but without needing this pairing between what you try to mimic and what you have at the beginning. And you can do it with unpaired data, which is actually quite interesting. The main issue with generative adversarial network is that sometimes they tend to create a bit often the same representations. They are not very diverse in their way of predicting the new samples. It's also quite difficult to train, especially for 3D data, especially because you have the two networks, the generator on one side, the discriminator, and finding the balance is actually sometimes a bit difficult. Normalizing flows now use them probably a bit less. I mean, we see a lot of GANs, a lot of VNE in medical imaging, probably a bit less of normalizing flows. Normalizing flows is basically trying to go from a distribution that is very simple to a distribution that is very complex through different stages, where you can always have a bijection between your original stage and your next stage, basically, and you combine your your transformation like that. So that allows you for a bit more of tractability of the learning, and everything is derivable in some way, a bit less of a black box. And finally, the diffusion model. So we mentioned that before, and it was the example that Parashkev showed us just before. And here it's learning how to recover from degradation and from noise. So you progressively add more and more and more noise to an image, you encode it, and you try to recover from that noise to give you a new sample that corresponds. And you can do it either at the image level, or you can actually go to a latent space, like you would go in a latent space for the rational encoder, for instance, and do your diffusion model there and go back afterwards. So there are always multiple ways of combining actually those different solutions and to create something new that works better for your own purpose. This is a quick summary of the general characteristics that we are looking for in generative models for imaging in particular. So we want high quality sampling, so data with high resolution. That's often the problem with VNE. It tends to be often a bit lower resolution, a bit blurry. You want high coverage, high sample diversity. That's sometimes a problem that you have with GAN, with not enough diversity. And you want a fast sampling, and that's something that sometimes you don't have with the diffusion models. So that basically each of the models that I presented before, they all have their strength, their limitations with respect to all these characteristics of generations that we may want to have, but we never manage to have on the whole. And the last thing that I wanted to mention with respect to methods is something that is really changing the way medical imaging is working at the moment. It's related a lot to the revolution of the large language models and all those generative AI we hear about in the general way, which are transformers, which are actually a way of understanding the data a bit differently, in getting to the model to be attentive to its own relationship. So basically being able to picture the relationship between a feature at some place and a feature at another place in an image, even if it's quite far away. So having like you would have in a sentence between a certain word at a certain point and a certain other expression at another point, so being able to do those links in a self-attention manner. And this is the process in which it works, basically trying to encode the position within different patches and trying to look at this relationship and encoding this relationship on a whole for the image. So now on to a few applications. So I mentioned denoising and super resolution. So typically, imagine here you have very limited time to get your T1 weighted images, and you need to have, or your flare images, and you need to have very thick slices. How can you get back to a very high resolution image? And again, use of either GAN in that case, or of diffusion models in that other case. Obviously, each time the people who propose the methods obtain the best results for them, the methods they propose in that specific case. So it's very difficult for us here to say that one is generally better versus that other one, just more that in their application, the solution that they found was working best. Be always cognizant of that, because people tend to sell, obviously, their best results. It's used, I mentioned, in anomaly detection. So anomaly detection be less. So it's a lot of a generative effort here because you don't know what the anomaly may be. So it's a bit less like when you know, oh, I want to segment white matter appearance, where it's very much of a discriminative process and you just want to figure out what's lesion, what's not lesion. Here it's, I have a scan, is there an anomaly anywhere that I can use for diagnosis purposes afterwards, for instance. And so usually it's a question of bringing in a lot of healthy subject in for the training, and then bringing something that is anomalous and trying to find the difference if you decode back to what would be the healthy potential looking image, making the difference. And there is potentially an anomaly somewhere, and that's where the generative aspects comes in. In terms of the prediction, so here 2 examples. One in the trajectories for Alzheimer's disease, where actually they use a combinations of VNE and GAN to try to see the evolution over 10 years. So they had originally only 3 or 4 years of evolution. They try to extrapolate the evolution of the ventricular expansion and atrophy. And on the second one, multiple generative adversarial networks stacked together to try to see how a tumor would evolve over time, according to then what is the original type of the tumor, what's the age of the patient, what type of treatment, etc. And so you can potentially look at conditions, distribution of a specific condition. One thing that people do a lot is cross-modality translation, especially in cases where you may have missing modalities or you may have changes in protocols. When you want to do multi-center studies, for instance, and it's not pre-arranged, but you want to do it post-hoc, want to do some domain adaptation or domain harmonization. And people have classically done one-to-one, so just pair of modalities. So I have a T1, I want a T2, and you need to train your full cycle GAN or VNA or whatever. In that example, it's slightly different, is they are able to do multiple modalities at the same time, where they have actually a way of saying, well, I want to put that image in the style of a T1 contrast enhanced, or of a flare, or of a T2, etc. And that may be useful for specific cases where actually, according to your protocol, you may have just one of them or two of them missing for whatever reasons or whatever happened during the scanning session. And here the two last examples are a bit more exploratory and are a bit less used at the moment, but currently, more open to creative thinking, let's say. In terms of synthetic images, so that one is a work from King's from 2 years ago, trying to look at synthetic images and how we can share synthetic images instead of sharing the raw data. So sometimes it may be very, very difficult to share the raw data, but you may want to actually share something that you can still work on and research on that looks like the true distribution of what could happen. So here you condition of, okay, I want typically a brain of that size with that amount of atrophy, that amount of ventricular expansion, and try to show me something. And they produce actually 18,000 scans like that, fully shared for people to be able to use according to their needs and following a decent distribution. So all what I've presented mostly before was on what I use classically as images, basically. And then I was like, okay, let's look into things that I'm not that familiar with and that I'm not doing that much. And I found examples of application in fMRI where actually people were using generative AI to try to decode back what would have been the visual stimuli that would have been given to people just based on the brain fMRI. And where they showed that actually the solutions of VAE and GAN combined was potentially very useful to that, and being particularly in the similar color and closer to the original examples and all of their so reading basically generative AI to read your mind. And one thing that may be useful to some others as well, and linked with the LLM revolution that I mentioned before, everything related to radiological report generation, or trying to understand and discuss with a chatbot with respect to the analysis of images. So sometimes you have models like that are based on a large amount of data, also models based on foundational models, meaning based on very, very large amount of data. But here, not only asking, is it this or is it that, and doing a discriminative, providing a discriminative answer, but using the generative properties of text generation or report generation to bridge back the different modalities of imaging and natural language processing. Here's an example with MedFlamingo, where you combine text information about a given patient plus the imaging and trying to come back with what could that be and what could have happened. And then you have alternative models, which you call conversationalist model, where you can go further and ask as another prompt, but what makes you tell that? And you go to the next stage of explainability then of your of the generation, which brings me to my conclusion here on all the different potential issues and potential unknowns that we have in terms of generative AI and imaging. As with everything, training is key, meaning that the training data you have is actually very important, and people have shown that if you have bias in your data, if you are, for instance, mostly focusing on certain subtypes or on certain population, actually you can contribute to generate back that bias without even seeing it. So keeping that in mind and trying to find ways of actually assessing how much bias in your training you are generating, even when you think that you are synthesizing new data that could account for that, maybe actually if the training data you have is not reflective enough of the reality, you will still not be able to, generate what is there out in the real world. The question of evaluation as well. When we segment lesions, I know which metrics I have to use. I use my DICE, I use my boundary metrics. I can use a lot of different metrics that have been very well defined. For generative AI and imaging, it's way more difficult. What is a good image? How do you really define it? And especially for medical images, right? Especially when models become more and more powerful and actually they fool the discriminator, they fool the engineer who finds them really good, they may fool the junior doctor, but they won't fool the expert doctor. And then, how do you say, that's actually not possible. It's not possible in a single person to have that type of presentation and that other type of presentation. But if there is nobody to tell us, actually, that's not feasible, we potentially have problems. And so we need to continue thinking of how do we make sure that what we generate is not just a figment of our imagination that cannot happen. We still want to normally generate things that are real and not deepfake, especially in the medical world. There is a problem of security and privacy. So obviously, I was saying before, for sharing synthetic data may be the solution forward, but there still may be ways for mal-intentioned individuals to actually hack back where the image comes from and to identify actually where the training data come from, even if you synthesize data. So there is still a bit of a unknown there as to, is it really private when you synthesize new data? Do we have issues of potential re-identification of the training? Or can we actually have other issues such as people altering for some reason the training and going to make us produce wrong data or wrong synthetic data there? So again, work probably to be done and to understand exactly what the limits are there. I mentioned explainability because obviously we may want to know where the generation come from and trying to see where we are, where does the final image that we have tell us something. And obviously there is a computational cost. So here, at UCL, we are very lucky to have a lot of computational power. That may not be true in all settings. And especially the large models that I mentioned before, they require quite a lot of training facilities and computational facilities that may not be available everywhere, which also may lead to, bias there as well to access to this possible generative AI development. So a lot of potential, but still a lot of responsibility for everyone trying to use those type of methods, and a lot of work and fun stuff for us to do. That's it.
Thank you so much, Carole, for starting us off and raising all of the possibilities as well as the problems. So we've got time just for a couple of quick questions, if anyone has any. I might kick off by saying, for someone who doesn't use imaging data sets, are you selecting which model based on the research question you're asking, or are you selecting the model that you choose based on the data set that you have and the structure and the quantity of data? And
I guess both of them are important, but you probably won't. That's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, basically, because you probably won't ask a certain question if you don't have a data set accordingly, but you may have a question and then create a data set that may fit your problem and then combine that with a model and potentially develop a certain aspect of your model that deal with the limitation of your data.
Okay.
So I think it's a like three-way iterative process all the time.
And with the simulation examples you gave, how big a data set do you need to then use generative AI to add extra data and be representative of a population?
That's a very complex question. I think that we don't really know. So a lot of models, especially based on foundational models that I mentioned, that are actually pre-trained models on a lot of data that is existing out there, are trying to leverage that to do what we call few-shot learning, where you may need only 10 or 20 of them, of new examples of your specific situation to be able to move forward with your application. But again, it's a domain and problem specific thing. So one thing that may work with only 20, actually you may not realize, but your distribution is slightly more complex and you may need more. So it's very difficult to say, oh yeah, I know that with 5 you will have enough. It's more a question of others have done it with 20. If I get around 20, can I get something? If not, then I go back and try to see something new.
Okay, great. All right, well, thank you very much. If there are no more questions, I'm going to now call on James. This is the last talk before coffee, so this is your last educational discussion before we launch into the case studies. James is a professor of neurology at King's and director for data science and health AI at King's.
I've got a number of different hats, but essentially the key bit is that I'm no longer an academic. I stopped becoming an academic some years ago, officially, although I do still a lot of research, but I work for the hospital in the NHS. And although that does say 100% human-created content, I did lie that some of the images are AI generated, perhaps. I didn't screen them all. Unfortunately, in this business, there is a lot of conflicts of interest that I need to declare. I work with a lot of tech companies and a lot of data programs across the NHS. So today's menu, I think we're running a bit low on time, so I'm probably going to drop the large language models bit, because I think that a lot of that is already in the open press. But I like to talk about data, because that's what I came into this originally on before AI became a trendy word, and it's to understand the landscape of data, because data is the fuel that drives a lot of the production and use of AI technologies, whether generative or not. So this is the hierarchy of needs. If you don't have enough data or big data, then everything up there doesn't really work very well. And that's not just for the making of it for scientific purposes, but also for the using of it. So although it is very interesting to make toys which can function, pass a Turing test, I think the key bit is to actually make it useful. And to make it useful, you need to deploy it. And when you deploy it, you need pipelines which plug into the AI to make it useful. And so you need this hierarchy of needs. And this is a message I speak to many of the other directors and executives all the time in NHS, that they stop trying to solve the problem from the top, solve the problem from the bottom. Obviously, that doesn't always catch on. So, health data. Are we talking about the same thing? Is data, often people talk about data, they're talking about their data, their version of data. But data is an extremely generic word, and I think that is the issue, because people conflate meanings when talking to each other. And this is the helpful terminology I've used, and obviously within this audience, perhaps you may be more familiar with working with new data, i.e. data that you manually collected through painfully yourself, or research data from research data sets, or from trials or particular research studies. But there are obviously other kinds of data sets, and most big data belong in the real-world data category. Real-world data meaning data that's generated as part of routine care or routine activity. And that generates a lot of data. That's why it's big. A proportion of this is obviously siphoned off and used as research data through various research study processes. but real-world data is several orders of magnitude larger than research data. And there isn't a lot of it is sitting in the hospitals. There is obviously synthetic data, which obviously we've had some discussion about this morning. A lot of other data sets which we often don't talk about, but exist as well, is claims data, which is very popular in the US, largely because it's easier to source than many other data sets. But claims data is basically insurance and billing information about healthcare payments. This data exists in the NHS as well, even though we don't have an insurance system. It's just that we're billing the same person. Okay? The issue with claims data, however, is that it's not as granular. Granular meaning that it's not, it's often lumps things into categories rather than going into the source nature of the data item, and therefore it lacks semantic depth. And depth is what you want when dealing with generative AI. So it was surprising, actually, when I looked at this with the NHS England, is that actually people high up in our governments and our agencies don't actually have a very clear view of the flows of data, because it is a really, really complicated ecosystem. And so we actually, together with one of my fellows, Joe Zhang and others, we tried to map this out algorithmically by tracking flows and reading all the Freedom of Information Acts, as well as data release and flows from the Health Research Authority and committees, and we mapped out the flow of data. And these algorithms all exist. And what we did discover is that actually there is a lot of data already leaving, but the problem is that most of them are actually farming the same sources. The same sources being claims data of the NHS, so business intelligence, which is not suitable for some things, but not really suitable for a lot of research and generative AI. And obviously the other factor as well is, I've changed the different colors, the people at the top, the green and oranges, and the research institutions of the world derive most of the benefit. The core infrastructure at the bottom get little of the benefit back, and therefore the infrastructure continues to collapse. And so this has been in a Darcy report this week. And so we've been mapping it with the Tony Blair Institute, trying to map out all the different data types, not just kind of claims data, but all the different types. Episode data, pharmacy data, imaging data, imaging report data, pathology images, pathology report data, genomics data, sequence data, variant data. And we're mapping that, and you can, certainly we've got an open Git page which you can contribute to the data flows, and this is all part of the Tony Blair Institute work that we've done with the Darcy report. And so we're mapping all these flows so that there is a more sophisticated conversation about data, about deep data, not just shallow data, which we imagine the NHS has. So what is inside NHS data? Okay, examples, there's the patient record itself, called the EHR, but then there are appointments data, which in UCLH and King's and Guy's is all integrated as one thing, but in some hospitals there are separate systems. So appointments data, it's certainly in GP practices, for example, many of the appointments data are actually separate. These are scheduling bits. Then there's order communications. I want a blood test. I want a scan. This is just sending requests across the system, but obviously they store information as well. Then there's prescription data in the pharmacy. There's LIMS data, which is basically laboratory management data, which often contains the results. Some of these things feed back into the other systems, radiology systems, and other things for more business purposes, what we call medical coding. These are examples of the kind of data, but honestly, there are, when I moved over to King's from UCL more than 10 years ago, there were more than 300 databases. And many of them no one knew they were still running. There was no one maintaining them. And we had to consolidate a lot of it. And so there's hundreds of them. How is data produced? So there is a human over there on the left who inputs things into a machine, essentially, a desktop. Inputs it as a document, either typed up in a Word document or dictated through a secretary or through some sort of scribing software, or they click some forms on the table. And that's how the data in. And the other multimodal data is captured by machines or images, and then they're stored there. And then a human reads them and generates a report. and that report is stored. Now, what happens is that this report kind of sits around here, and if I want to deliver care, I just read the report, and that's fine for delivery of care on a one-to-one basis, not very useful for a large-scale data-driven economy. And this process is all manually done, and this process here is also manually done and converted into coded data, which then leads into EHR. If you want to plug into here, you will find that it's surprisingly empty, because this is the bottleneck. This person, that person, that person, that. There just isn't enough humans to read every single document. And there isn't enough humans up here to interpret and record it. And there never will be. And so this I discovered fairly early on when I moved to King's, and so we worked at this layer. Get all the reports, get all documents, harvest it, and train AI. This was 2015. And this means that we remove this bottleneck, and in the future remove those bottlenecks. So AI, whether generative or not, to produce enough data to feed all of you. So most of the unstructured data, or the dirty data, is all in all kinds of funny formats, and traditionally not looked at in the healthcare system because it's just too difficult to analyze. They work on coded data. And there are standards, but the standards are inconsistently implemented. And to be frank, even in large countries where it is enforced, it's still incomplete. Even in North America, where you're paid by the code, it is still incomplete. And that just highlights that the bottleneck is that there will never be enough humans to do this work, even if you pay them. So what we do is that we use pipelines to lake all the data. Far left, take all the pieces of Lego on the floor and pile them into one big pile. And then you sort them, but rather than sorting them with humans, use algorithms to do that, and adding semantic structure, and then normalizing, and then actually applying. Now, most researchers are funded on specific projects, on specific research topics, and they work on disease X, disease Y, or a specific modality. Most of their work is project-specific or specialist-specific. Unfortunately, if you do it on this space over here, it's very difficult to scale over there. But you have the expert knowledge here. Well, that end of the scale does not actually require that much specialist expertise. It's just a lot of heavy lifting, technical heavy lifting, infrastructure building, and most of the work can be pulled across domains and across specialties. And that's what we did at King's and Guy's, in which we got lots of different specialties to agree to pool. And we plumbed it all in and pooled all data and started semantically structuring it. And semantically structuring it with AI systems. And this idea now is the idea of a lake house. So rather than a warehouse where all the data items are neatly packaged into little boxes, you first lake them in one big massive pool, and then bits of it is fished out and packaged into warehouses. And most of the big cloud providers provide this, but essentially you can build lakes inside hospitals, and the data in the lake doesn't have to be clean. You clean it in the lake once it's there. Trying to clean it later on or early on is not scalable. So a lot of what I talk about is I try to focus less on theory and more on practice, because I've learned the hard way that the hard things are not the science. The hard bits is actually the practice and delivery. And so this is my journey. I was here more than 10 years ago with Sonia and Parashkev in here, and moved across into a NHS job. And then around that time, we started laking data, as you see up there, and we worked with the 100K genome, because 100K genome needed to find patients who didn't have a diagnosis. And you can't find a patient without a diagnosis of coded data because they don't have a diagnosis. And so we had built a search engine. And so we built a search engine, we built the lake data, and then we built a search engine inside the hospital, and then we just installed it, then we expanded with the Rehabilitation Research UK, and then the Maudsley Hospital, all mental health in South London, Then we installed one in UCLH here, and then we started expanding. And during that time, obviously, the rest of the world started moving on to all the different AI large language models and such. And we, fairly early on in 2016 or so, I realized I couldn't read every single document that existed. And so then I needed to start using the NLP work, and we started scaling up at large-scale NLP. So with NLP services and guys in Thomases and Kings, which read the data and we build it into workflows. Clinical coders, staff members who are essentially paid to read notes and to essentially code them and build the NHS or for audit purposes or for payment purposes. They are now using our system to code, which means they also train the AI, which means that eventually the AI will be able to be good enough to deep phenotype everything. And then it won't be a bottleneck anymore. And we did this together in HSX, and we're in the middle of doing it in lots of other hospitals. And we're doing it from the bottom, largely because the data is the bottleneck. And if you don't have enough data, the data that you generate will have structured missingness, and that structured missingness will generate bias. And so this was us deep phenotyping the whole of King's College Hospital for 20 years. Took us about 6 days. Using NLP. This is kind of high level, kind of medium level, high level concepts, just reading through thousands and thousands of text documents and Word documents and scan documents. We can then look into the semantic depth in the graph networks and map them all out as each patient to which patient's document has what mentions, and what mentions have what relationship to each other in time. And then we can generate deep data registries of anything in retrospect. So this, for example, is epilepsy on the left, epilepsy medication swapping over the last 10 years. What drugs on the left, what they switched to over a course of time. And this is without a preconceived data model. This is just reading and generating the data model as you go. Then my cardiology colleagues generated aortic stenosis one of the last 10 years. Then the heart failure guys became interested. They wanted one too. I think your colleagues with Hani Marcus and others built on normal pressure hydrocephalus here to generate a registry from that. Annual life care, not something that's typically thought of as a registry and super hard to do for privacy reasons. We generated together with our patients. Registry. So we can now generate this. I wouldn't say on the fly, but we can generate this in a month. Then, because we can do this, we can map all the data, deep phenotype everything. So not just diagnosis codes, intervention codes, symptom codes, disability codes, everything. We can then map these codes out in time for a patient. And if you imagine each patient, these codes as words in a sentence, then all those algorithms, those transformers that we use to autocomplete our emails, auto-suggest words in a sentence or complete our text, they can be used to autocomplete a patient. So rather than a generative AI to generate words in a sentence, you generate a patient. So that's what we did. We did it in the Maudsley, we did this in King's, and then we tested in a US open data set called Mimic to generate patients. And these are AI which has been self-supervised. We didn't teach it anything. We just show it as codes and arrange them in time and train them in over probably about 1 million patients over 15 years. And this is cross-disease. So you can suggest codes which, so it's a kind of a risk prediction across everything, rather than for disease X, disease Y, or complication X. So this is only about 1 million. So it's obviously biased. And it's obviously biased by time as well. So treatments 10 years ago would have been different from treatments now. So it can only tell us about what it has seen. So we're in the process actually of doing this nationally in a national SDE for 60 million patients in the UK. But again, that data is biased because it hasn't read everything yet. It's only read the 1 million here. But we can generate this on the fly. And basically, but this is only from text. This is only from reading records. We haven't included all the cool stuff that we have seen, all the multimodal stuff. And that all this means that we still have a lot of structured missingness. And this structured missingness, we have to work out ways to address it, because if not, we will just embed bias and missingness within our generative AI models. So how am I currently mitigating this? Well, I mitigate. One is to just enrich everything, and so that to not only capture data that people bother to input in, but to capture all data that they, if it's in whatever form. And we're doing that right now in our trusts. And so kind of supplementing this bit with AI. Then we are linking across sector. So I'm on the One London Technical Design Authority, and we're kind of linking GP records across London at the moment, the London Data Service. And the AI Centre on the south bit is providing a lot of the technologies, and what the linkages are happening through the North London Data Service. But this is obviously tabular data from GP records, which, you know, it's not necessarily that deep, but it's long. It's wide, it's long and wide, longitudinal. So that is helpful for that regard. And meanwhile, our NLP solutions is extended way beyond London. We've got sites in Birmingham, in Lancashire, in Southampton with versions of our technology. We have it in Amsterdam, running in Dutch. I didn't train in Dutch, the Dutch did. We have it in Monash. We're in the middle of setup in Thailand, Sweden, and Singapore. And this is cleaning the data at source. So that's kind of it, because I think we're running lowish on time, and I don't want to kind of go into the whole large language models bit, because that could end up dragging on and on. But I'm sure every one of you have probably done hundreds of YouTube videos on this, so you'll need another one. Okay.
Thank you, James. Wow. Right, any questions for James? Carole.
Thank you very much for the talk. You mentioned a lot of missingness. What about errors?
Yeah, so certainly there are lots of errors as well. And so often what we have to do is we have to record in the provenance of the data. So not just, so inferred data, the degree of confidence in terms of the provenance of if someone put something in wrongly, we have to encode in the ability to correct that. And so what we tend to do in data lakes, is not to say that the old thing is wrong and delete it, or write over it, is to keep the old thing, which may be wrong, probably is wrong, but to record a new thing with a new addendum to that old record. But all this requires a large amount of infrastructure work and changing the style of thinking in handling data. Nowadays, the style of thinking is keep all the data in a processable way, and even keep even the wrongness, especially keep the wrongness.
Yeah.
So my disclaimer, I'm a clinician trying to understand generative AI. My question is slightly related to that, is that you have correct data, but over time, guidelines change, new treatments come, new modalities come. So how does the system accommodate that? Because you deep phenotype and you have something as an outcome, but that's based on data that has actually changed dynamically.
Yeah, so the data set drift is definitely a thing. So the thing, I mean, there are ways to detect kind of data set drifts, but I think the most efficient way to do this, and the safe way to do it, is to do this continuously. So don't take a data set, train a model, and your model is perfect. Have a whole pipeline that continuously generates data and check for data set drift. So that's a lot of what we do, is that the models that we produce, 2016, 2017, we update and we rerun across everything repeatedly, and there is drift within it. Definitely, guidelines change. So whatever generative models we make now are definitely not suitable in 2 or 3 years' time. There's a whole field in other industries called MLOps, which is the idea of creating models and monitoring the performance of these models against data set and data set drift. There are ways to do all this, but you need the infrastructure to do that. The issue right now is that there's a lot of people rushing to make AI models, because of the buzz and the money in the system, but many of the models are unlikely to be useful. But we're producing the intermediate step, the data which will allow us to measure bias.
What is the challenge with the multimodal bit and adding that into or integrating it in with the NLP work?
So at this stage, obviously, just a lot bigger servers, a lot more compute. At this stage, there's a culture element as well. So in the culture element, what I refer to is within the NHS, there is a split between the people who work on health records and the people who work on images and pictures. Radiologists as well as pathologists. And they come from completely different tribes and they don't even talk the same language. And when you talk about data, they all confuse each other.
Yes.
And so often the issue is that they're all often working on separate platforms.
Yes. And presumably when you try to bring in genomic data, then you have also the issue of it's never
And so a lot of this
secure.
is actually driven by commercial infrastructure contracts.
Yeah.
So this is not something that they can be solved that, unfortunately, at our level. These are contracting decisions.
Yeah, sure. Okay.
I think a good point of the fact you're saying the models train now and the usability later. I think the best readout of that is the share price of NVIDIA as being one of the driving force of the drop of the value of that. No, seriously, it's driven about this. So this frenzy exponential growth of that sector to be able to support these models will be a drop of what is going to be then running.
Yeah. So certainly I don't think, I mean, obviously we can publish papers on AI models which can do this and that right now, but I don't believe most of those that are produced now will be not just suitable for use, but we want to use even, because there'll be just better ones that you make.
And with that, I'm going to wrap up the first session. Coffee is waiting, just a little bit over time. We're going to take a 20-minute coffee break. But please do come back to have a much more discursive session on, trying to tackle some real-world problems with these approaches. Thank you.